So with that, I want to turn it over to, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this session, Steve Dubb. Steve has spent over a decade working on community economic development strategy. He's currently the senior editor for Nonprofit Quarterly, where he writes, curates, and edits content for the organization's many media channels with a focus on community wealth building and community economic development. Steve, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon, everyone. We wish we could be there in person, but understand under the circumstances that that's not possible. So this session is on economic justice and system change, and I'm direct our economic justice program at Nonprofit Quarterly. I want to briefly introduce my panelists. Rapal Meka, CEO of Nexus Community Partners in St. Paul, Emily Coano, the co-director of Wellspring Cooperatives, and co-founder of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Gar Alperovitz, a principal and co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, D.C. So why a session now on economic justice and system change? Well, NPQ is interested in economic justice because it comes down to our values. If you go to our website, you'll see on the About Us page that we envision a world in which we live in an active democracy whose values are fully grounded in human rights, economic and social justice, racial justice, and thriving communities. And I think it's fair to say we're pretty far from that today. And so I know this is a pivot from, I don't know, looking over the details of the CARES Act, for example, which I know is an earlier session. But we think it's important, even in the midst of the hard and tragic times that we're facing as a country and indeed as a world, to look to the horizon and what more liberatory post-pandemic economic structures might look like. So we believe it's important to move forward in that context. And in this panel, we're trying to build some groundwork for what we hope will be curriculum that we're developing for the field as we look at alternative economic structures to the ones that we have today. And with no further ado, I want to introduce Rapal Meka to begin this panel.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rapal Meka, CEO of Nexus Community Partners. I'm excited to be with you here in this discussion on economic justice and systems change. Excuse me, because as Steve said, I think we ought to be very present in the moment and really focused on how people's lives are being impacted on a day-to-day basis. At the very same time, I think we should be looking forward to the future that we think we ought to own. Because at this point in time, we know we have a market narrative and an economic system that guarantees that the masses don't benefit. And so part of the discussion that makes me excited is that we'll be talking about strategies that are multi-laned and multi-layered in order to present alternative methods. Nexus is a community building intermediary. We use intermediary very purposely because our focus is on the human, social, and cultural capital in communities, more so than the physical capital, but we partner with the physical developers because we know place matters. That place is more than geography, is experience, is memory, is history. And we try to do most of our work at 70% around landscape shifting work. It changes the way that people experience their lives and their opportunities. Our work sits at the intersection of community, philanthropy, government, and economic development. But all the work that we do falls into three ships that I'll just touch very briefly on. The first ship is authorship, and it really is about engaging communities and shaping their lives, their aspirations, and their opportunities in communities. There's a institute that helps us with that. Leadership is really about cultivating power in communities. And we have Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute that raises up people of color and places them strategically on decision-making boards. And then we have our third ship is ownership, which really is about finding ways to distribute broadly and anchor wealth in communities for the long haul. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of how Nexus came to that ownership work. We've invested in small business development since our beginning, over 15 years. And along the way, what we discovered was no matter how fast we helped to establish small businesses, that the systems of inequity and racism allow for a pace that did not catch up with the change that we were trying to see. And our pivot was to look to ways to invest in more broad-based ownership models that would connect connect wealth to communities for the long haul. Our first exploration around this was to look around the country to see what was in play. And one of the places that we looked first was Cleveland, to look at the Evergreen cooperative model that was taking place there. In fact, we took a large group of folks out there to see how it was operated, came back and started to try to get some work done, and it flopped. And the reality was the environment that we were trying to do the work in wasn't ready for it. And so we backed up. We brought Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhart in, who has a powerful book called Collective Courage. If you haven't read it, you should. And we began a different strategy. The lesson that we learned was sometimes when you're doing innovative work, you have to create the environment that the work is happening in at the very same time that you're doing the work. And so we set out on a 3-year strategy. And that 3-year strategy we called seeding, cultivating, and harvesting. And in order to create the environment that we wanted to try to build in, we spent 1 full year doing nothing but educating people around community wealth building. What are the terms? What are the concepts? What does it mean? How does it look when you're actually engaged in it? So that people could begin to talk with each other. And that community engagement learning series brought community folks, cooperative developers, government, private sector, economic development folks, all in the same room over the course of some months, dealing with, again, what is broad-based ownership and how does it look? And this was our effort to make sure that whatever work we entered into for the long term, it had a place to live. That was our first year. And out of that, we did including some of the sessions included government and philanthropy as well. Out of that, we came up with a 10-year plan and then asked ourselves, if we were to engage in that plan, what would need to be in place in 3 years? And out of that, in 2017, we moved into cultivating. That first year was seeding, the second year was cultivating. That mapping, we did a mapping ecosystem retreat, and it produced 4 strategies for the organization that we thought would help us to get at a strategy for systems change. And we knew in doing that that it had to be an ecosystems approach. It had to be multi-layered, and as you will hear from some of the other presenters, it had to be multi-layered as well. The first strategy for us was to develop a cooperative development fellowship. We found that when you look around the Twin Cities, if you want to do cooperative business models, there were no people of color that could train you in it. And so we developed a fellowship that would teach people the technical skills of co-op development, and we drew that fellowship from communities of color. We initiated the North Star Black Cooperative Fellowship, taking Black people back to their histories of cooperative economics and collective care, and then building business enterprises around that cultural base with technical support. We established a business conversion initiative that looked to take advantage of the huge wave of retiring baby boomers who don't have succession plans for their businesses. Only about 15% or so. And what are there ways to get those owners to sell their businesses to employees? And we specifically targeted businesses that employed large numbers of people of color. The next area that we zeroed in on was government. We knew that at one point or another, that if you're building from the ground up, innovative strategies, sooner or later is going to run into policy. And the sooner you can, the earlier you can engage government around policies that support strong, sustainable, cooperative ownership models, the better off the people were going to be who were trying to do the work. And then the last, we knew they would need capital. And so we partnered with some local folks and some national folks to begin to build a pool of capital to specifically support initiatives that were led by communities of color. Our next phase was to move into harvesting. Harvesting was about building capital pool again. We pulled together government officials, elected officials, got them organized around broad-based economics. We initiated a worker ownership plan, and then we tested out engaging a government entity in incorporating community wealth building into their long-term 2040 plan. That was the initial stages of our harvesting. To date, I would say that those government entities each have a strategic plan around community wealth building. The City of St. Paul has it built into their 5 priority areas, advancing cooperative economics. The City of Brooklyn Park has it built into their 2040 plan, looking at ways to produce funding and strategies around it. The City of Minneapolis has built into its budget a plan and dollars to support cooperative economics. And the City of Richfield is looking at cooperative housing strategies. We've, along the way, engaged the chambers to bring the private sector to the table. And then in terms of resources, we've leveraged a couple $1 million to support this work in the Twin Cities where it was not happening in the beginning. And we see this work as not only about business and economic development, but we see it as an anti-gentrification strategy. We see it as an on-ramp for folks that would have never imagined themselves to be business owners. We see it as a way of interrupting multi-generational poverty, and we see it as a way of impacting policy. Those 3 areas of authorship, leadership, and ownership are important to us because we believe that who plans for, who governs, and who owns really matter.
Great, thanks, Rapat. And just want to encourage people who are online to please put your questions in the question box and we will get to them. Next up is Emily Kwana. Emily?
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, thanks. Ripa, that was great. So my day job is, I'm the co-director of Wellspring Cooperative. We also built on an anchor institution model and community wealth building. So I'd love to continue the conversation, but I'm not going to talk about really any of that. I'm gonna jump over to really talking about system change and solidarity economy, which is sort of the other hat that I wear. So as we know, this pandemic has really upended our world. Many things that seemed impossible now seem like part of the solution. Things like universal healthcare, the huge stimulus package, calls for a moratorium on evictions and utility shutoffs. We have also seen spontaneous self-organization and of acts of solidarity, cooperation, mutual aid, and community production. So this is a moment that provides an opening to push, as Rapat said, to push for long-term changes, systemic changes, to transform our economy into something that supports people and planet rather than blind growth and profit maximization. But what do we mean by system change? I propose that it's really important to have greater clarity about what we mean, because it makes a difference what your long-term vision is. So looking at the next slide, so you'll see that on the top row, there's a split between capitalism and post-capitalism. And under capitalism, we have neoliberalism, which is the dominant system, certainly as exemplified by the United States. But before neoliberalism, there was another paradigm, capitalist paradigm, which you could call like New Deal, the post-war model. Economists refer to this sometimes as Keynesianism. So the government intervention is more legitimate. There's acceptance of the need for a social welfare state. There's acknowledgement of market failures, and that the state has a legitimate role to play. Social democracy, such as the Scandinavian countries, is New Deal even more so, right? Even stronger role of the state, stronger social safety net, etc. But it's still, all three of these paradigms are still capitalism. Even Scandinavia is dominated by private capitalist corporations. The next row down that you see in pink is democratic socialism with question marks there because it's contested. So the way that Bernie Sanders talks about democratic socialism really amounts to social democracy, right? He talks about larger public sector, you know, Medicare for all, lots of state policies and programs. But what he doesn't do is that he doesn't publicly challenge or raise the challenge of democratic ownership and control of production, which is really a core principle of socialism. And so I think that there's a pull, right, under the post-capitalism columns. You'll see that there's socialism, right? So democratic forms of socialism. And so a lot of people, myself included, would consider democratic socialism as really socialism, right? Not social democracy. So I did want to make that distinction, since democratic socialism is getting a lot of attention these days. So why does it matter? Well, it matters to know where you're headed, what your vision is, what your long-term goal is. So I believe that New Deal capitalism is a vast improvement on neoliberalism. I believe that it can be a transitional in building towards a post-capitalist future. But I also believe that if you just try to fix problems of racism and poverty and inequality and climate change without being clear about the fundamental logic of the capitalist system, and without being clear about where you're headed in the long run, you end up reforming capitalism. Now, you might conclude, you might end up with a position that New Deal capitalism, or if we could ever get there, social democracy, is great. And that is a perfectly valid position. Personally, I don't think that we can survive capitalism. I believe that the fundamental logic of capitalism is inherently unsustainable, inequitable, undemocratic, and plays on divisions of class and race, ethnicity, immigration, gender, etc., in order to maximize profits. So regardless of where you end up, I think it's at least important to be clear about where you're trying to go. One of these models of capitalism, one of these paradigms of capitalism, perhaps a kinder, gentler one, or post-capitalist, because it matters. So I'm going to talk now about post-capitalism. I'm going to focus on solidarity economy, which on the purple block. Wait, can we go back one? Sorry, back one before you go. So solidarity economy is very big tent, includes many different approaches. certainly democratic forms of socialism, as opposed to, you'll see at the far right end, there's authoritarian state socialism, like Soviet Union or China, which solidarity economy would not embrace because it's not democratic. But so solidarity economy would embrace both democratic forms of socialism as well as other things that maybe don't even have an ism label. Okay, so now the Prezi. I'm going to focus in on solidarity economy and talk about it. Solidarity economy is a big tent, as I said. It's a global movement. It's grounded in principles. So yeah. So the principles are solid. It'll look a little different in different parts of the world, but in the US Solidarity Economy Network uses these 5: solidarity, equity in all dimensions, race, class, gender, etc. Participatory democracy, so not just voting in elections, but democracy in your communities, your workplace, etc. Sustainability and pluralism. And by pluralism, we mean it's not a one-size-fits-all model. It's not a blueprint. There are many different paths to the same goal of building a more just and sustainable economy. Next. So the big circle, if you can remember the whole picture, is the world ecosystem, which we see as next. The natural systems, next, which has elements such as life, water, minerals, energy, animals, etc. Next. We also see the world and ecosystem as those that are socially created. Next. Things like spirituality, language, society, culture, knowledge, etc. Okay, next. So we start with the world and the ecosystem, and then what your governance looks like will determine what your economy looks like, the rules of the game and your institutions. So in a solidarity economy, for example, we would embrace things like participatory budgeting, community-led democratic development, collective community ownership, but we would also embrace some things that are pretty mainstream, some things that are in the public sector, like regulation, like certain state public sector, restorative justice is another example. So some of it is mainstream, some of these practices are quote unquote alternative. Next. So now pulling back out to, as an economist, you know, we use these, there's many ways you can look at it, but so we use these spheres, these major economic spheres, these 4 spheres. And you can see that in all of these spheres, there are examples of the solidarity economy that exist. Many of them are working very well. So in terms of production, we have worker cooperatives, producer cooperatives, care economy. We would absolutely embrace non-monetized, non-waged care work. So that's something that all of us engage in all the time. We take care of our kids, we take care of our elders, etc. DIY is also important, self-production, community production. Okay. In terms of distribution and exchange, things like fair trade, barter, alternative currencies. In terms of consumption, we have examples like community land trusts, housing cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, collective kitchens, etc. In terms of finance and capital, we have examples like credit unions, very widespread. Credit unions are a form of a cooperative. Other examples are public banks, peer lending, cooperative loan funds. So, you know, there are many more examples in all of these spheres, but suffice it to say that there is a huge base upon which to build. We don't have to start from scratch. And the solidarity economy works to pull these currently disparate pieces together to articulate an alternative system, a post-capitalist system. I think I have one more. Next.
Yeah, Emily, can you wrap up fairly quickly?
Okay.
Yes,
Okay, so yeah, so this is just to give you a picture of what's going on. There's these various international bodies. There are a number of countries that have national framework legislation to support solidarity economy. Ecuador and Bolivia have included solidarity economy in their constitutions, and there are also countries that have solidarity economy ministries. Okay, I'll wrap up there. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. That was great. And next up is Gar Alpovitz. Gar? Gar, I think you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go.
Okay, fine. Thanks. So thanks very much. First, I want to say I'm really delighted to be here because I'm from Wisconsin and glad to be back in the Midwest and in Minnesota. I used to work with Gaylord Nelson, the Wisconsin senator who started Earth Day, which is coming up in just a few days. And Senator Mondale used to walk in the door, and even Senator Humphrey when I was just out of college. So it's great to be back home. I want to put this discussion in a little slightly different vein. And what you see all of a sudden this last few weeks in Washington, and we saw it at the Great Crisis, when things collapse, big things happen all of a sudden. Trillions of dollars move at certain points in time. Very big possibilities can occur. So I want to put that in the framework as we go down the next decade or two as to what system change might involve if we prepare the ground properly. That was also true of the New Deal. Almost all of the things that took place in the New Deal were experiments on the ground in the 1920s, which came into fruition in the 1930s with the New Deal. So changing the system is conventional in history. It happens all the time. So the kind of things that Emily and Rapal were talking about on the ground locally are critical ingredients that I believe can lay the groundwork potentially, if we work together and if we think about it clearly, for transformation over the next period. I say that my heroes are the people who worked, civil rights workers who worked in Mississippi in the 1930s. They laid the groundwork over 10, 20 years, 30 years for the 50s and 60s. So I think that's where we are in a way, the things that people are doing locally and nationally. But the big picture is, if you don't like corporate capitalism because of the inequality, the ecological destruction, the expansionism, the trade problems, the dislocation of workers, et cetera, and if you don't like state socialism, really it's incumbent to think through, and what's wonderful is many, many people are thinking through, as Emily discussed, but there are many, many people writing about this, experimenting with this, beginning to think through, what is a system we might like? How would we develop it? And our next system project at the Democracy Collaborative just published a book on this, is about to publish a book collecting papers on different ideas, including the ones Emily was talking about, particularly starting there, but all the way to social democracy and beyond. But the view I take is you must start ultimately with the community level, so that if it doesn't work at the level of the community, it's not going to work anywhere else. And how that is structured is a critical element. Someone mentioned, I think Rapal mentioned Jessica Nemhart Gordon, a good friend of ours who came and worked with us when we first started this work, and the Cleveland Project, which is an attempt to experiment with community-wide nonprofit corporation around a whole 20,000 person or 40,000 person center to which are attached nonprofit or worker-owned companies. That's one model, which takes the whole community in. And also there are many freestanding cooperatives. That's a kind of beginning point. In Preston, England, it's similar, a community-wide structure with many variations, but democratizing ownership is a primary principle of a system beyond state socialism, obviously, and beyond corporate capitalism. And building up from there to state structures like the community bank and state bank in North Dakota, which has been there 100 years, and many, many states are beginning to think about state-owned banks, like public ownership of what happens when we had the last crisis. We actually nationalized General Motors, and we nationalized Chrysler, we nationalized big insurance companies, and then with public bailout, we gave them back. But big institutions, at some point, are larger than a community. Some of them are larger than a state. Anybody who flies around the country at all or takes a train knows that those are big, big pieces of capital that are probably larger than one community. So how do we structure a whole model? The next system work that we've done, and many, many scholars and writers and activists are now thinking concretely, if you don't like capitalism and you see that state socialism fails, what do you want? Solidarity economy opens one door. Another door begins with community vision as an integrated structure and literally says, how do we build from the bottom up and begin to restructure over time? So that work, I think, is becoming increasingly self-conscious. Instead of just experiments, which you absolutely need, we're having people begin to think through, well, if you look back at the civil rights workers of the 1930s, they thought through a 10, 20, 30-year strategy and began to say, if we build from here to there, where does that go? And if you think that way, you begin to see intermediate structures at the city level. For instance, in Boulder, California, the city began to take over the utilities. If you see it, you see cable television at a larger level. You see in some states, California is now talking about public ownership of banks. It's in New Jersey as well. Beginning to think of a model, you go always to the local level first and only go up in scale if you have to, and begin to think about regional structures like the Tennessee Valley Authority, all of which put public structures in place instead of guided by public principles and democratic principles and egalitarian and hopefully environmental principles as well. Building from the bottom so there's experience and control from the bottom up. And ultimately, and I would emphasize this strongly, a vision of community from the bottom up so that there's a culture as well that is an ecological culture, a culture of solidarity, a culture that is structured in ways that support rather than divide people one another from one another. So a culture beginning with community. I call it a pluralist form of commonwealth, a pluralist commonwealth in which commonwealth of large scale and medium scale, but also small businesses, becomes a dominant principle, and commonwealth in support of sustainability and alliances between all forms of American, particularly Black and Hispanic and white working class, the people at the bottom, 80% who control far less of the economy than others, moving together from the community up to build that kind of system. So it is a system with design. It begins to look at community and structure, and at the local level, many different parts of community, but also a common direction that we begin to debate. And let me stress that. This subject, as the crisis deepens, as the Donald Trumps of the world sharpen their focus, as we reach more and more difficulty with traditional models and traditional politics, building from the bottom and also beginning to think through, to actually discuss, beginning to debate, what do we really mean if we were serious about the next 20 or 30 years? I have great admiration for conservatives who did this over the last 30, 40 years, thinking through a new direction. And I see many progressives, like the folks I came up with in Wisconsin and friends in Minnesota as well, beginning to think concretely. If you don't like the direction of corporate capitalism, if the traditional liberalism that I was brought up into and worked with in the House and Senate and with Gaylord Nelson and with others and Senator Mondale, if that passed and we lost its strength as the labor unions collapsed to a mere 6% of the labor force, we are in a new era. It's important both to think and to act with thought, but also to begin building experiments at the bottom up so that we have something for the next crisis. It is quite amazing, just to return to it, what happens repeatedly when there's a crisis in the system, either the Great Depression, a big crisis, or, and these are predictable. In 1964, there was the Goldwater defeat, which brought into the House of Representatives 76 new Democrats, and most of the Great Society was passed in that 2-year crisis for the Republican Party. Again, the Great Recession opened new doors for things that could have happened and might happen again. So I want to open the picture that many things can be done at the bottom level, building up, and also ultimately at the national level and the regional level and state level, because the system is so unstable. So in a way, it always comes back to what we do concretely, both walking on two legs, as a friend of mine says. What can be done locally, here and now, but also not forgetting the need to begin to build a vision and a politics and a culture that looks to system change and think through concretely, which models do we want? I want to say one last thing. We have the next system project in the Democracy Collaborative, where I'm located, is just about to publish a book with many, many models of the next system reader, the new system reader by Gus Speth, my co-director, who is a well-known ecological leader. But it begins to put this debate into our discourse. What do we really mean by the next system and systemic change beyond rhetoric? Concretely, if we're finding great inequality, ecological destruction, disruption, racial injustice in the current systems, if state socialism is a non-starter, if social democracy has unfortunately lost its base as labor unions have collapsed to a mere 6%, how do we think through the next stage and begin to build from the bottom up? Thousands of people, literally all over the country, are experimenting, and we're at the level, I think, where we begin to think through that clarification of direction, which gives common purpose and common direction. My heroes are kind of, I often say, are the people working in Mississippi.
I need you to wrap up if you can.
Yeah, I want to say this is my closing view, and it's a way I think about the next 10, 20 years. My heroes are the people working in Mississippi in the 1930s. They established the foundations, step by step, without which the 1960s civil rights movement would never have occurred. And I think all of us need to think that way. How can we lay foundations for a larger transformation, even as we build from the bottom up locally, step by step along the way?
Great, thanks, Gar. And let's see, Rapa and Emily, if you can unmute yourselves, and I'll ask a question, and then I see some really good questions from the audience, so I'll move to those questions. You know, I wanted to start, I guess, with the pandemic, and the irony. You know, way back in February of 2020, I wrote a piece about, talked about after the next recession, and I got criticized by some folks. It's like, what do you mean there's gonna be a next recession? That was 2 months ago, right? 3.5% unemployment at the time. There's been 17 million people who've lost their jobs since then. We're now at the highest rate of unemployment since the Great Depression. So we're facing a systemic crisis in real time, it would appear. So if we look at the current crisis, with a systemic lens, with community wealth building, with a solidarity economy, with a view of point from the pluralist Commonwealth, how should we think about this moment in time? And Rapal, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we've talked about some of the kind of key opportunities that exist now. I think the systems, the very nature and the purpose of systems is to allow for high levels of predictability. And that's exactly what we've gotten out of the current systems that we have. I think this moment that we're in is a moment where things are fragile, where things are not as firm as they used to be. Although some of the roots of the challenges that we've faced are still strong, I think we're in a moment where if we take a look at wedging into the present and looking into the future alternative models, I think we have a great chance at changing the experiences that we'd have in the future. That right now, that this kind of, as harsh as this moment is that we're in, is also a moment of great possibility that we could be thinking differently about in the long term. And I think it holds some of the same kind of values that we've talked about here. I think strategies, economic strategies that are not extractive, that don't ensure that the masses will always not be the owners of their own labor, that people will not be perpetually financially vulnerable. That if we flip that into long-term strategies, and I think that both Emily and Gar speaks to this idea of ecosystems, integrated long-term models with no one size fits all. I think that we have the opportunity to really bear down on some change and the kind of change that could be sustainable. I do think it calls from us another layer of willingness to step into areas that we've not known. The places that we've been have been rooted for a very long time. I think that being different is going to be the challenge for us. I think the psychology that comes with being different is going to be a huge challenge for us. But I do believe that we're in a moment right now, right here, where if we were to wedge some alternative strategies into place, not knowing fully where they might lead us, but know where they're going to take us away from, I think we have an opportunity in front of us.
Great, thanks. Emily or Gar, do you want to step in?
No, I would absolutely underscore what Rapa said. And I think that the trick is to say, you've got to do things on the ground that can be done. But many, many other periods of history, people have also stepped back and say, how do we build a big vision and a big movement? Particularly in the part of the country that I'm from, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, there was a whole progressive movement that started with very small change and exploded into a very powerful movement. So I think getting the sense that, yes, there's things that can be done locally, but how do we begin to think about actually transforming a system? I'm a historian part-time. Systems come and go in history. That change is as common in grass if you stand back. So I think we're on the verge of laying down the foundations for a true transformation. So I think it's a major, major period of history. If you take the long view, there's so much going on that fails around you, right, that the kind of work we're doing now is laying groundwork. If we work on it intelligently with dedication, laying groundwork for transformation rather than thinking of this as just experiments. They are very, very important historically as laying groundwork for the next future.
Yeah, Emily, I kind of want, thanks, Gar. Emily, I wanted you to jump in a little bit. I mean, you have sort of wear a couple different hats on this, right? I mean, you're dealing with a business that's challenged by the current economic environment, like everybody. And you're seeing all this explosion of the type of mutual support you're talking about. So how do you think about this moment?
Yeah, I mean, so we help to develop a network of cooperative businesses, and they're being hit just like all small businesses, and we've gone to the same well, right? So we applied for the payroll protection and all that kind of stuff. So it's tough. But I also absolutely think that the crisis is an opportunity. And so the mutual aid stuff, I think, highlights the need. We haven't talked about this so much of resilience. And so it's not only about jobs and a paycheck, but it's also livelihoods. And so how I think it's important, not only crises like this bring it out, but also things like automation, AI, job destruction, means that we need to be able to provide for ourselves. To what extent can we support our own livelihoods in our communities through community production, right? Shared use of cutting edge technology, in addition to low tech things like community gardens. So I think we should keep an eye on that as well. Some of it's about jobs and good jobs and democratic worker control of those jobs, but some of it I think is about livelihood, and we should pay a lot of attention to that as well.
Thanks. So I'm going to go to a question from the audience. I think this one is sort of directed at Rapa because it's about philanthropy. But so I'm going to pick on you. So, so the question is, what role does philanthropy play in directly addressing inequity beyond just addressing symptoms, but actually promoting systemic change?
Yeah, I think, and you're starting to get some of this. Can you hear me? I think you're starting to get some of this now. I think that philanthropy, at the first step of philanthropy is to acknowledge the role that philanthropy has played in the conditions that we currently have. That philanthropy has made some major contributions to change in this society, but it has also been a major player in some of the greatest kind of barriers and inequities that we see. So I think starting in a place like that, because otherwise I don't think you can get effective, long-term, equitable change if you don't start with acknowledging your role and your contribution to the conditions that we're in. But I also think philanthropy is in a position, in the Twin Cities, and I've seen it in other places, philanthropy has the capacity to hold spaces that a lot of other sectors just don't have. I've seen in the Twin Cities philanthropy convene the private sector, government, community, folks in economic development, all in one space. What happens when you get in that, when folks get in that space is another thing. But philanthropy has the ability to convene and bring those spaces together. Philanthropy also has the ability to put up resources. And so I think in the Twin Cities area, a lot of the community wealth building work that we're doing now has been philanthropy leaning in ways that they've not leaned in before. And I think that that's a major role that they could play. I think that the last thing I would say about philanthropy is philanthropy helps shape the narrative. What philanthropy asks of people and report out to people shapes the narrative that we experience ourselves in. And if philanthropy is holding up the wrong measures of what quality of life looks like and how do you get there as best practices, then that's the message that people hold up as the kind of the prize, if you will. So philanthropy's role could be a major role in shaping a new narrative, that what it puts out either advances change or hinders change. And so I think that philanthropy has to look at itself as a partner in this and not just a contributor of resources in it, acknowledging its role and its place to begin with, but also knowing that it can't do its work without the other players at the table.
Great, thanks. So this is kind of an interesting transition question. This also came from the audience, but you know, and the question is, how do you move away from capitalism when economic power is held by capitalists? And how do you do that without hurting Blacks, Indigenous people, people of color while doing this transition? And we obviously we're seeing people of color hurt extremely in the current pandemic, right? Everyone's suffering, but the most is definitely people of color. So I don't know who wants to jump on that. Gar, is that you? Okay.
Well, I think I think in some ways it's self-evident that you need to walk on two legs. That is, the projects need to build, and there are many projects that are building, cooperatives and worker-owned companies and community development structures and agricultural projects. The country is filled with very creative and exciting projects, some of which are just good projects, some of which are building simultaneously a politics which says we are putting forward things that are foundations for step-by-step transformation. And that's a different way of thinking about it. So I think that that's a critical way of understanding it and beginning simultaneously to, in a way, see yourself like those civil rights workers as people acting. It's very personal. It's not so much about projects, it's an existential stance. Am I trying personally with every project to build transformation, or am I doing a good project? And that's a very personal understanding, but it's critical to seeing this as a stepping stone in the larger time. And simultaneously, we're getting these big opportunities. The current system has many flaws and creates crises like the one we've had now, like the big Great Recession, that crisis, the Great Depression. So opportunities regularly occur, and it's important to think not just locally, but also how do we think through what we would really want to do nationally? How does the banking system that's being in trouble now shift resources to community, overwhelmingly changing its priorities? How do we begin to articulate political demands that cohere with and strengthen our community needs? What I think is the biggest single obstacle to systemic change is people thinking you can't do it, that you really can't think and demand big change at the same time you build groundwork change. And I just want to say, historically, that is just not true. People who have the long view have commonly transformed systems. It's very hard. It's hard to think of long term. There are many obstacles, but indeed that's the rule of the game. And I think we're in a perfect moment where people need to confront the most powerful obstacle, personally unwilling to think maybe we could actually think that way. So I want to encourage people to widen their view of what they're doing, because you yourself and we ourselves are often obstacles to taking a much bigger step and thinking bigger thoughts than we commonly do. So system change is very personal, as well as how do you design something better than corporate capitalism or state socialism or community building system. Put it in that language. And I say that as an economist, not only as a political person.
Yeah, no, the vision has to be as large as the problems you're trying to address.
And it's personal.
Yeah. Emily or Rapal, do you want to address the other
Yeah,
half of that question?
I do think it's a complex question, but I think that there are some, you know, Gar, you constantly mention this kind of, there's a certain kind of simplicity to this as much as it is a complex issue. And I'll just speak to how Nexus has kind of come to those three areas of authorship, leadership, and ownership as it relates to transition and transition in a way that BIPOC communities are not harmed. I think and I ended my comments earlier by saying who plans for, who governs, and who owns matter.
Absolutely.
And so part of this for me is I think about BIPOC communities is not just diverse communities, but communities that bring knowledge systems that are fundamentally necessary for us to be in a different place in the future. That they're not just different cultures or points of views, they're knowledge systems that I think hold some valuable insights and principles that's key to getting to where we're trying to go. And so engaging early on community and community voice and figuring out and putting in place structures that give what I call bending systems that allow communities to influence how systems work is fundamentally critical. That's the role that when I talk about authorship, is shaping experiences, that's what that is. The leadership piece for me that I spoke about is that we have to be very intentional and very targeted about key decision-making tables that influence not only the short-term, but the long-term possibilities in BIPOC communities. And part of the leadership work for us is trying to figure out how do you tap the best in communities and those that are emerging in BIPOC communities, train them up around a conscious equity framework and place them strategically on boards and commissions where decisions are being made about people's lives on a day-to-day basis, not just to react to response or respond to conditions, but to forecast what the future might look like. Okay. And then the last piece that I would say is as long as BIPOC communities don't own anything, they will always be at the mercy of others. As long as they're not the owners of their own labor, then they will always be subject to the vulnerabilities that come with not having any. And so part of the strategy around ownership and broad-based ownership is to begin to spread wealth more broadly, and not just to deliver it in people and wealth, but place and wealth. That wealth can be tied to place. And that in all that, there's a shift in the psychology that we have to bring that I think is important. And I know that's not the complete answer, but I do believe that, as Gar has said a couple of times in this conversation, if you don't start with where the people are at, then whatever large-scale strategies you put forth can't be sustained.
Great, thanks, Rapal. So I think I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question. I'm going to throw this to Emily so you can chime in. But it's a long often used phrase about moving at the speed of trust, right? So you can, and yet there's like imperatives, of getting system change work done, getting economic justice work done. How do you think about that balance?
I think that trust is important. I think relationships are important. I think in order to do that local work, as well as just my experience in building cooperatives, building that trust and those relationships is absolutely, absolutely important. At the same time, I also think that we can work together without, it depends what exactly you mean by trust. I mean, some things need to move forward without a personal level of trust because we can't know everybody, right? So then maybe you're building institutional trust, right? Through transparency and following through on what you say, right? And being honest. And so I think absolutely it's important to center that. I don't know that it necessarily needs to slow us down. It is just part of the process that we need to be super mindful of building and tending to and strengthening all the time.
Great, thanks. So we're at time, and I have more questions, and I wish we could get to all of them, but thanks for the great questions that everyone provided. You know, I can, the conference organizers have my contact information. I can try to forward some of those questions to folks to get them answered. I should mention, you know, Nonprofit Quarterly, we do monthly webinars on economic justice issues. We have one coming up. It's the third Thursday of every month at 1 p.m. Central. There'll be one this week looking at economic justice in Fresno, and then we'll be looking at the pandemic as a whole on May 21st. So I want to thank the conference organizers, the sponsors, and of course my co-panelists, Rapab Mehta from Nexus, Emily Guano from Wellspring, and Gar Alperovitz from the Democracy Collaborative. And thanks so much, and I'll kick it back to Sandra.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for such an amazing session. That was really great, such deep thinking and such helpful information, and 100 people on this webinar learning and thinking along with you at the end of a very full first day of our conference. I want to remind, well, first I want to thank our panelists again, and thanks Steve for moderating the panel. And for the attendees, I want to remind you that we're going into a couple of special sponsor sessions. If you want to learn more about Mutual America's Community Partnership Award, we've got a session starting any minute now to talk about that. And then partners from Clifton Larson Allen will also have a session where they will answer your questions about the CARES Act, certainly a topic of interest for many of us today. So thanks again to our panelists. What an amazing session. And all of the recordings from today's sessions will go online by 5 o'clock tomorrow, and you as an attendee will get an email about that. So with that, our session is ended, and we invite you, I look forward to seeing you on day 2 of our conference, 1 week from today, Tuesday, April 21st. Thank you.